I really think that the legal profession can be conducive to well-being. Being a lawyer is about helping other people, lifelong learning, adhering to high ethical values, service to the community. And, if you look at what philosophers and psychologists have written for centuries, those are the ingredients to a happy and healthy life. For whatever reason, the way that we organize the work that lawyers do has alienated many of us from those core values. So that's a problem. But I don't think that all is lost.
This is a conversation I had with Dean Michael Marin, who heads up the University of New Brunswick's Faculty of Law. Dean Marin's an impressive guy. He clerked at the Supreme Court of Canada, he worked as an associate at a big New York law firm, and he rose to the top position at UNB Law at a relatively young age. But he's also faced some challenges. Dean Marin struggles with anxiety, just like me. That's one of the reasons why this episode is coming out when it's coming out. We recorded this conversation a while ago, but my anxiety has stood in the way of me actually pressing the publish button. Dean Marin and I open up about some of our personal struggles and some of the things that have helped us manage them. In fact, a lot of the improvements I've made in my mental health over the past few months come from the tips and resources that we talk about during this podcast episode. I hope it leaves you with even just a fraction of what I got from it. All right, let's get into it. So the reason that I wanted to have you on is you've been, I just call it prolific on LinkedIn with posts about lawyer well-being. Really caught my attention because I found the stuff you're talking about very practical and actionable. You had a post about this book, The Courage to be Disliked. I went out, immediately bought it. It's one of those things where you should have used an affiliate link or something, because I saw the post and immediately pressed buy, read it over a couple of days. My wife read it as well and just loved it. And I've now started to see some of those concepts from the book, which is based on Adler's School of Psychology. I've seen those principles in that book underlying the rest of your posts on LinkedIn, and you really using the tools that Adler teaches as a way of improving the lives of lawyers and your students and people around you. So that's why I wanted to have you on. I've loved the posts. It's been a help for me. There's a mental health crisis in the legal profession, and I haven't seen a lot of actionable, here's how you can make your life better. You seem to have given that some thought, and I want to chat with you about it. We'll say, obviously, we're not doctors. I've tried to do some things to improve my mental health and well-being. I've thought about some of these issues. I think you have too, but that's really all we can say is two people who have tried some things and are trying to find their way through it like everyone else. Does that match how you see your posts on LinkedIn and what you're trying to do?
Yeah, I think you've captured it exactly right. A lot of what I've been doing with our students at UNB Law and also talking about on LinkedIn comes from my own personal experience and my own search for understanding, my own efforts to overcome suffering. And as you say, a desire for advice that's actionable. We talk a lot about mental health as a problem, raising awareness about it, which I think is critical. But at some point, we have to get to solutions. Okay, so what do we do about it? Because if we just talk about the problem endlessly, we're not empowering ourselves or others. And so that's what I've really been looking to do. And I know that others are doing that as well. And so my hope is that as a legal profession and as a society, we start focusing a lot more on what we can do individually and collectively to make things better.
Well, let's do it then. Let's start with your top 3 actionable takeaways. What can lawyers do to improve their well-being?
First one would be to make exercise a non-negotiable part of your routine. Nothing has done more to help me cope with adversity and cope with anxiety than exercise. When I'm exercising consistently, I'm a different person. I'm more energetic, I'm more productive, I'm more fulfilled, I'm a better parent, I'm a better professional. I want that kind of flourishing for everyone. A lot of lawyers are suffering, and I often wonder what would happen if exercise was part of our lives on a regular basis. I know it's made a huge impact on my well-being. The second takeaway is to control what is within our control. It sounds simplistic, but I think as lawyers, we were programmed to focus on outcomes, right? As children, as high achievers growing up, we learned that we had control over the outcomes that we experienced in our lives. There were relatively few variables, and there's more of a correlation between effort and outcome. But as we progress in our education and our career, we introduce many more variables. And so we're not in complete control of the outcomes that we experience. And that can be a real shock. And so I think if we can learn to deal with that, to focus on the variables that are within our power, that's a really important aspect of promoting well-being. And the third takeaway is to broaden our community. The legal profession is a really small one. And if we focus too much of our identity on our profession, being a lawyer or a law student, when problems arise, they can have a disproportionate impact on our well-being. And so one thing that has made a huge difference for me is to broaden my community, to have friends outside law school and the profession. So to have normal friends, okay, not just lawyers. And how you do that, you can do it by volunteering, through hobbies, travel. There's lots of ways to do it. Again, a lot of these things sound simplistic, but when you actually understand how they affect your well-being, the mechanism, you start to see how powerful they really are. And it encourages you to persist with these habits. So those would be my 3 takeaways: exercise, focus on what's in your control, and broaden your community.
Fantastic. I want to unpack some of those, but I take it you didn't, and you mentioned a lot of this thought comes from your own experience, but you don't really stumble into thinking about these issues on a deep level and with frameworks unless you've kind of had some experience with these things yourself. Talk to me a little bit about how you ended up at this place where you're thinking about well-being and mental health on kind of a deeper level.
Yeah, basically, it's my own suffering. Growing up as a child, particularly in high school, through university and law school, I was suffering what I now know is anxiety. But at the time, I was oblivious. I just thought that this was the way I was. And throughout my career, when I became an adult, this pattern continued. And finally, I started to realize, wait a minute, this is actually debilitating. It's hurting me and the people around me. And so I got help. I saw a therapist who really made me aware, that anxiety is a mental illness, but crucially, it's something that's treatable. And that sort of started me on a journey of learning. I'm a lawyer, a legal academic. I love learning. I find learning empowering. And so when my therapist explained to me, what you're suffering is something called anxiety, I was, intrigued in the sense I wanted to learn more about it. And I think that is a really powerful strategy, at least it was for me, to become aware of our suffering and our feelings, how they work. I mean, none of these things are new. Humans have been dealing with them for many, many, many years, and much has been written and studied about mental illnesses. And the great news is that there are effective ways of dealing with it. And so that's essentially how I got started on this path for myself. So that journey goes back over 10 years. But it hadn't really entered my professional life until I became associate dean at the Faculty of Law at UNB. So that would have been maybe 7 years ago. And in that role, I was working a lot with students who themselves were suffering. And I started to see a lot of the same patterns in them that I experienced myself. And then as the years went on, I started to think that maybe we need to do something a little bit more structured around this. So we introduced a wellness program at UNB Law. We hired a wellness advisor, and we started a couple of years ago these seminars that I do on a monthly basis with students that address a particular aspect of mental health and well-being. And so that's basically been the trajectory. It started with my own healing, and then in my professional life as a law professor, noticing the suffering that was around me, trying to introduce my students and my colleagues to these ideas.
I remember a point in my life thinking, this is my superpower. This, call it anxiety, call it whatever you want. I can't treat this. I can't do anything about it because this is what makes me excel. That feeling inside of me is what's causing me to
perform well or accomplish some task. And I think when I started clerking at the Supreme Court, that really hit a tipping point where all of a sudden it was like, this is not good. This is not helpful. This is, like you said, debilitating, crippling. It's getting in the way of the things I need to be doing, and it's affecting my relationships and my life. And so that was a pivotal moment for me, going from thinking this is something that is entirely good for me to, hold on, wait a sec. I can probably, hopefully do something about this and still have all the good parts of my personality, but treat this debilitating condition.
A lot of lawyers and law students probably suffer from the same kind of thinking. I was exactly the same way, right? I thought that the secret to my success was this, what I now realize, a habit loop. So basically the way that anxiety would work for me is I would have some kind of professional challenge in front of me. So let's say it's an assignment at work or a court appearance or an article I was writing or something like that, professional challenge. Then I would freak out. Okay, so this is the behavior associated with anxiety. And for me, it was catastrophizing or having these thoughts, imagining the worst possible outcomes and rumination. So I would constantly thinking about these terrible outcomes and how I might be able to control the situation to prevent them. And that would just cause me to both suffer inside tremendously, but also cause those around me, my loved ones, to suffer because I was withdrawn. I wasn't present. But then this is critical about sort of how I understand anxiety to work is then I had the reward. And this is what you talked about, why it's your superpower. The reward for me was usually I would succeed. So at the end of that chain of trigger, professional challenge, the freak out, right? The negative behavior, then there was the reward, success at the end of it, right? And so what that taught me was, hey, this works. This is my superpower, as you said. And so it was something that I was conditioned to do over and over again every time I faced a professional challenge. What helped me understand this was a book by a psychiatrist named Brewer called Unwinding Anxiety. And he likens anxiety to addiction, right? And for me, I could see that. I could see that in my behavior, in my suffering. And in that book, he goes through specific strategies of how to break that habit loop. But yeah, what you said was exactly my pattern. And in working with law students and lawyers over the last number of years, it's fairly common. But what I want to emphasize is we can do something about it. We can do so. We're not stuck with this. All right. We can overcome it. And there are things we can do to get better.
We'll put the title of the book, everything, in the description. This time, maybe you can give me an affiliate link because that's immediately an Amazon purchase. I'm clicking buy on that and going through that one. But let's talk a bit about, because I agree, there are things we can do about it. I don't know that I've mastered that yet. I see those habit loops, and it does feel like an addiction to me that I've tried to break. And I think one of the helpful things, as you mentioned at the start, in terms of breaking that habit loop, can be exercise, replacing or subbing in exercise there. Talk to me a bit about that, how you see exercise working in terms of habit loops and anxiety.
Yeah, and I can give you a specific story about it, but let me back up a little bit. If you look at what Dr. Brewer says in his book, the first step is to understand your habit loop. Really think about what triggers your anxiety, right? What behaviors are associated with those feelings and that suffering. And then finally, what reward you're getting out of it. And so he calls this mapping habit loops. And then the second step is to really develop a distaste for that behavior, to really think about all of the negative impacts that it's having on your life. And then the third part is what you just mentioned, which is replacing the behavior with something else that's more positive. And for me, that's exercise. As I said at the outset, nothing has helped me more with my anxiety than exercising consistently. And so I'll give you a concrete example. About 5 years ago, I was deciding whether to apply to become dean of the Faculty of Law at UNB. And this was a pretty challenging process. It's quite public. You bare your soul in the application process. There's a panel of pretty smart people who are tasked with judging every aspect of your professional life to determine whether you're suitable for the role. Everyone gets a say in whether you're good enough, right? And so for me, this was the mother of all triggers because in the past, the triggers were private, whether it was a law school exam or a court appearance or a conference presentation. The prospect of humiliation was minimal. In this case, all eyes, at least within our small little world here in the Faculty of Law, were on me and whether I was good enough. Now, fortunately, I had done the work several years before this to understand the trigger, the behavior, and the reward. So I knew that this was going to be a trigger, right? And I also knew that exercise had a very beneficial impact on my well-being. And so what I did, knowing that this trigger was coming, I made sure that my exercise routine was dialed in. I had developed pretty good discipline around it before, but I knew that this time I would have to rely on that strategy heavily. And so I did, made sure not to miss any workouts, eat well, get proper sleep. The process was stressful for sure. Okay. There's a difference between adversity and anxiety. They're not the same thing. Adversity, is a good thing, challenges us, right? It pushes us to rise to the occasion. And it's not pleasant. But anxiety is when those feelings become debilitating, where they drain your mental energy, where they cause you to dissociate from other people. And so I'm happy to report that facing the mother of all triggers, yes, it was stressful, but I didn't fall into the symptoms of anxiety that I had previously. So that gives you an idea of how understanding the habit loops and understanding the mechanism of your anxiety. Everyone's is going to be different, but for me, that understanding helped me recognize that this was going to be a big trigger, and I needed to lean on my coping mechanisms. And exercise is a really powerful one.
That's awesome. You had that awareness and understanding in advance. I think I'm maybe at this moment the counterpoint to that story, which is that I started running this summer and was really enjoying it. Was getting in the process of dialing in an exercise routine, which was almost entirely running, and injured my hamstring in late October. And it just has been so slow to recover that it really threw me off what I was doing and how I was functioning well.
Yep.
And the effects have just been devastating. So I'm just now picking up the pieces of that and getting back into a modified exercise routine where there's some strength training included as well, and trying to minimize the risk of injury when I am able to get back to running as I was. But can see the correlation, just like you, in terms of when I didn't have that to fall back on and that exercise routine wasn't there and I use that to sub in for the less productive behaviors, the more harmful behaviors, just kicked right back up. And it went from this period of kind of the best mental health of, I thought, my life to right back on the other end of the spectrum.
There are setbacks, right? That's okay. It's important. And I've had many, I've had many. And it's important not to beat ourselves up, right? So I don't want anyone to think, hey, there's ways to solve all these problems. It's easy. And if you're still suffering, it's because you haven't figured it out. I don't think we should blame others for their suffering. And I don't think we should blame ourselves for our suffering or our setbacks. And the other thing too is that you focus on what you can do, right? So not everyone can run. Some people have bad knees or disabilities or whatever. But there's always something that you can do. And so when I'm talking to students, they'll say, well, I can't do this particular thing. I'm not good at it. I try to encourage, what can you do? Let's focus on what you can do. And let's try to develop a strategy around that.
Yeah, it's a good way to approach it. I was a little slow to adapt and realize that I should be modifying, not recognizing the impact that would have if I just completely went from full exercise to zero exercise. And so that's a lesson learned as well.
Look, and that's very common. I mean, a lot of lawyers and law students are perfectionists, right? They'll approach their exercise routine maybe the same way as they do law school or their practice. It's got to be perfectly dialed in. I got to wake up at this time. I've got to run this distance and this time. And if I can't do that, then it's not worth it at all. I think that the most important thing is not perfection, but consistency, right? It's showing up every day and doing something. It's that consistency over time that's going to have the results, not just physically, but mentally as well.
So what does your routine look like?
I've had lots of different ones over the years. So now I have 2 young kids. And obviously a demanding job. And so I have to wake up very early in the morning to exercise. So I try to wake up around 5 a.m. to exercise. The first part of my workout is 45 minutes of strength training, followed by 45 minutes of moderate to high intensity cardiovascular activity. I try to do that around 6 days a week. And, I don't want people to think that, oh, okay, well, I have to do exactly that in order to promote my well-being. No, not at all. I mean, everyone is different.
And I take it you didn't just wake up one day and start doing an hour and a half of of exercise. So, another point worth mentioning there, I'm sure people can, you build up and you find what works for you rather than saying, okay, tomorrow I'm setting an alarm for 5 a.m. and getting in the gym and doing an hour and a half.
100%. I'm so glad that you emphasize that, because if you try to go, 100% right away, what happens? You risk injury, you'll be sore, you'll be discouraged if you don't reach that expectation that you've set for yourself, and then you won't be able to get into the habit. So you have to start progressively, right? So let's say you want to start up waking early, and 5 a.m. it is your goal. Okay, start half an hour earlier than you're waking up now. And if you miss a day, if you sleep in one day, that's okay. Don't beat yourself up. Just try again the next day. It's that consistent practice of showing up every day that cements the habit.
I want to talk about your second takeaway, and the courage to be disliked. In the Adler school of thought, there's this term separation of tasks. My wife and I have picked up on that one quite heavily in our household. Complaining about something in the day or what someone might think of us. That's not my task. And I really like that idea of you have things that you can control. That is your focus, and any energy spent on things you can't control, that's wasted energy. That's someone else's task and not up to you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Adler's view is that a lot of human suffering stems from interpersonal relationships or interpersonal conflict. And he said that's attributable to the desire to control other people, to try to control the way they think or behave. And this is where, the idea of the separation of tasks comes from, is that it's dangerous to try to control other people for a couple of reasons. One, people don't like being coerced or manipulated. And when you try to do that, that leads to conflict, right? The second reason is that if you try to appease people, right, change them through appeasement by changing something about yourself, you're compromising your values, and that can really chip away at your identity. Right? And identity is really important because it gives us grounding. When we lose our identity, we feel like we're out of control. We don't know who we are. The separation of tasks says, and if you want to use a lawyer analogy, there are certain things that within your jurisdiction, okay? And there are certain things that are ultra vires. How other people behave or think, even how they behave and think towards you, that's their task. That's their jurisdiction. Your task is how you behave and how you think. So this relates to some of the things I've been saying online about reputation and integrity. So I see reputation as something that is the task for others. Reputation is how others think of us, and integrity is how we treat others. So integrity is entirely within our control. We're the ones who decide how we treat others. But reputation is for someone else. Now, the two concepts overlap because if we act with integrity, then there's a good chance that we'll have a good reputation as well, that people will like us. They'll think highly of us, but not necessarily, because there are a lot of things that impact our reputation, right? It could be the circumstances that we find ourselves in. It could be the types of people that we encounter, partly our behavior. So, sometimes we can act with integrity. We can treat people justly and fairly, but they can still dislike us. And that's okay, because that's for them, right? And because reputation isn't entirely within our control, when we make a mistake or something bad happens as a lawyer, we can feel despair about it. Oh, my reputation is ruined. There's nothing I can do. Whereas if we approach the problem from the standpoint of integrity, it's much more empowering, because integrity is within our control. Okay, I made a mistake. Right? What do the professional values tell me about how to approach this? Integrity provides a path to redemption, because we know what to do. We can fix it. We can take responsibility. If you look at cases of lawyer misconduct, a lot of them, the lawyers weren't actually disciplined for the initial complaint or mistake, right? They were disciplined for not communicating with the Law Society, for not cooperating with the investigation. And I wonder whether that's because a lot of lawyers approach this challenge from the standpoint of reputation. And they say, oh my goodness, I have a complaint. My reputation is ruined. And they realize, maybe implicitly, the reputation isn't entirely within their control, that other people will think ill of them, and there's no overcoming that. And I have to say that we reinforce this idea in law school. From the very first day of law school, we tell students, your reputation is everything, right? But what we're telling them is that the thing that will impact them the most is something that they can't entirely control. And again, we're dealing with sort of A-type personalities who have conditioned to focus on outcomes. And so I think this is potentially harmful to well-being, but also harmful in terms of professionalism. I'd like to see us focus a lot more on, okay, you made a mistake. It happens. The thing to do is be guided by these values, the values of our profession. So taking responsibility, communicating, and to celebrate that, right? I think that someone who takes responsibility, who behaves with integrity, despite making mistakes, deserves a lot of credit. And so I don't talk about reputation anymore at the law school. I talk about integrity. I think that needs to be more of the focus in legal education and profession. I think we talk too much about reputation.
It's interesting that your reputation is everything line is so pervasive across at least Canadian law schools. I'm sure that's maybe even broader than Canada, but it makes you wonder if there was a law dean conference one year where they all decided they were going to...
Were we all conspired? Maybe, but it is firmly ingrained. And I want people, when we're talking about the separation of tasks, right? We should care less about what other people think of us, but we should certainly care about other people. So this separation of tasks idea is not an antisocial construct, right, or concept. We should certainly care about how we treat others. We should care about other people's suffering. We just shouldn't be concerned about controlling the outcome.
I couldn't agree more. It is something that affects me a lot, or would help me write a newsletter to a large audience as well. It's easy to get hung up on what are all of these people going to think about what I've written. And the more I'm able to focus on the things that are in my control, writing something that interests me, that I find engaging, not to, it's like you said, with not being antisocial. It's not that I don't care about what the readers think. It's that I deliver my best work if I focus on the things that I can control and the things that are in my power, instead of worrying and trying to please every single person who may have signed up for a newsletter. So that's kind of the concrete example from my experience, and that I'm trying to focus on.
There's an example for all those listening, right? I mean, Dylan, you're focusing on what you can control, which is producing great content, right, in an engaging and distinctive way. And as you're seeing, people are responding well to that. And so these two things do align, right? I don't want to suggest that, they're completely distinct, but by focusing on what is in your control, right, you maximize the potential for, positive outcomes. That's the idea. But by focusing on the positive outcomes, by obsessing about that, you drain so if all you thought about was how your readers would respond to your content, right, you'd have less energy to actually produce the brilliant content that you do. So it's also tied to this idea of how you allocate your scarce resources. So there's another book, Dylan, I think we're going to have a long list here, but it's a classic book called Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, one of the founders of positive psychology. And one of the ideas in that book that is often overlooked is the idea of what he calls psychic energy, so basically mental energy. And Csikszentmihalyi says that we have a finite amount of mental energy, that it's a scarce resource. And this is what I realized why anxiety was debilitating, because I was spending so much of my scarce psychic energy imagining scenarios, right, that were fictitious, and trying then to figure out ways to control things that I was imagining. It was exhausting. And my therapist said, what if you took that energy and actually focused it on the task at hand, right? And that was a real eureka moment for me. And it sort of relates to what you're saying. If you fixated entirely on the response of your readers, you wouldn't be devoting your finite energy to writing. And so I think that's a great example of the work that you do.
Well, let's talk a bit about broadening your community. You mentioned some examples at the beginning, stepping away from the legal community, broadening your interests beyond that. Talk to me a bit about how that can help, or what you see the benefits of that being if you're broadening your community.
Yeah, I'll start with an anecdote. So a number of years ago, I was struggling sort of in my professional life, had some challenges, and my wife really helped me out. She's been a great support for me and sort of, prompted me maybe 10, 12 years ago to finally do something about my anxiety. Our first daughter was just born and had another episode. And, I wasn't able to connect with my newborn daughter, and I was just completely miserable. So my wife said, look, Mike, you got to get some help. And that's when I went to see a therapist, went down this road. But she helped me again a number of years ago. Fortunately, this time my situation wasn't as bad as it was previously, because I had done a lot of work to get better. But I was still struggling. And what she noticed was that the reason I was struggling was because I was so focused on my little world, right? My little professional world. I didn't have very many friends, okay? It's not because I'm not a likable person. It's just that, I guess for whatever reason, I had neglected my friendships. And so I didn't have a lot of friends. And a lot of the people that I associated with or spent time with was people that I worked with or through work or did similar kind of work. So my whole identity was focused around my work. And when something goes wrong, Adler talked about this as well. If all of our suffering or a lot of our suffering comes from interpersonal conflict or problems within our community, right? If that community is narrow and something goes wrong, it can have a disproportionate effect on our well-being. Because if these people are everything to us and there's some conflict or problem, we think there's nothing else, right? And we can start to despair. And so what my wife did is she lent me her friends. Okay, she lent me her friends. And a lot of her friends are not lawyers or law professors. And so she started organizing dinner parties every weekend and inviting, as I said, normal people over. And I would sometimes dread these dinner parties. Oh, here we go again. Usually it was on the weekend after, a work week where I still was suffering something that happened in my professional life. And so, okay, here we go. Now I have to have all these people over and clean up or whatever. But what I realized getting to know them is they didn't give a crap about my little world, right? They have all kinds of other interesting things in their lives, right, that they're focused on. And so learning about them, their families, their work, their hobbies, it sounds so silly recounting it, but it broadened my community. It took the sting away from whatever was happening in my little world over here that I had defined so narrowly, right? And it showed me, hey, there's a whole world outside of this, with different people and opportunities and problems that are beyond you. And one of the reasons why we suffer conflicts or setbacks is that we have a hard time putting them in perspective. We think that they are way more significant than they actually are. So by broadening our community, we put those things in their right place. I realize, okay, my life really isn't that bad. So that was an example. My wife helped me broaden my community by lending me her friends. Another thing that I'd done throughout my career, but that I started doing when I became an associate dean of the Faculty of Law, is I serve on administrative tribunals. I started out as a vice chairperson of the Workers' Compensation Appeals Tribunal, and now I'm a vice chairperson of the Labor and Employment Board in New Brunswick. So this is kind of an odd thing for a law professor to do. Most don't do this sort of thing and don't have professional commitments outside of their sort of day job. But this has been critically important to me on a whole bunch of levels, professionally for sure, but also in terms of my well-being, because it broadened my community. Academia can be a pretty small community with its own, problems and challenges. But what these opportunities allowed me to do was step outside that world, 1 or 2 days a month. So when I was on the WCAT, I would do 1 to 2 hearing days a month. So not a huge time commitment, but a world completely different than the one that I occupy on a day-to-day basis. I encountered injured workers and I learned about their suffering and I learned about the legal regime that helps workers recover and get back to work. I met the lawyers and officials who are involved in the administration of that system. And it broadened my community, gave me perspective. When something bad was happening at the faculty, some problem I was trying to solve, and it was overwhelming me, I had that experience of my broader community that helped me put it in perspective.
Well, that's great for people who don't have a spouse who can lend out normal friends. But you don't necessarily have to go beyond the legal profession. There can be adjacent ways within this profession to expand. It makes me think of my time as a Crown attorney here in Ottawa. The Crown attorneys are in the courthouse. It feels like you're very much part of the apparatus there. And even when we go out for drinks or socialize, it's a lot of war stories, a lot of shop talk. And there's a few judges here who are known for giving lawyers a hard time, particularly the Crowns and particularly the younger Crowns. It didn't make me feel good to go to work and to be, I would say, bullied. I think it's fair to use that term for a couple, at least, of the members of the judiciary. People have rough days, but it did feel at times like this is harsh. And thinking back on that, my community was so narrow. I am part of the Ottawa courthouse. And as a Crown attorney, it feels like this is everything. If I'm getting a hard time from a judge, wow, this is really bad. And it's easy to catastrophize that. If I had had a broader community at that time, or if I had been thinking about things through this lens, that might not have stung the same way, because it wouldn't have felt like my entire world is not going according to plan.
That's tough. And I'm sorry you had to experience that. I think there's a lesson in your story for how to be a good colleague as a lawyer. I still remember to this day, my first court appearance. It was a pro bono matter and it was a disaster. It was a motion. I won and lost it within the span of an hour. I actually got an order in my favor, but then it was reversed within an hour without an appeal, which sounds completely bizarre, but it was, state court in Brooklyn, and I guess rules don't apply. Anyways, so I felt terrible about this, and it was an important case for my client. I was representing an HIV positive couple who had been evicted from their apartment, and I really wanted to help them. And I had invested a lot in this motion, and I thought that the way it went was really unfair. And and I questioned whether I did everything that I could. I felt badly about it. And when I got back to the office, my colleagues, the senior lawyers, the partners, they all kind of rallied around me and they say, hey, tell us what happened. And I explained the situation, and they told me about similar situations that they've had. Hey, it's okay, Mike, like you'll try again, and that similar thing happened to me. And hey, you learned from it. Here's how to deal with it. Here's a way to come back and move the file forward. Hopefully in your, commiserating with fellow Crowns, there was a little bit of that. There was a little bit of, helping each other put things in perspective. I think that's really important. And I think we have that within us as a profession, The legal profession fundamentally, I think, is a helping profession. I think we're disposed to help. I just think that sometimes we forget, and we also maybe are preoccupied by other things, or overworked, et cetera. And there's a lot of focus now on how to restructure the work environment in legal organizations that can hopefully promote the kind of mentorship and giving perspective and encouragement that can help us deal with the kind of adversity that you described.
It'll be interesting to see that work continue. I think there's a lot to be done in terms of restructuring and reorganizing the legal profession to make it more sustainable and empowering for the new generation of lawyers. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about or think is worth mentioning that we haven't covered?
I just encourage listeners who may be suffering with struggles similar to ours that there are things that you can do. There are people who are willing to help. These aren't just ideas, they're practical. You can learn about them. I really think that the legal profession can be conducive to well-being. Being a lawyer is about helping other people. Being a lawyer is about lifelong learning. Being a lawyer is about adhering to high ethical values. Being a lawyer is about service to the community. And, if you look at what philosophers and psychologists have written for centuries, those are the ingredients to a happy and healthy life. I think for whatever reason, maybe we'll do another podcast and talk about that. The way that we organize the work that lawyers do has alienated many of us from those core values. So that's a problem. But I don't think that all is lost. I think we can lean on those core values, realign the profession with them, and in doing that, promote a more sustainable practice, as you say, with lawyers who are happy, fulfilled, and flourishing.
I'd love to have you back to dive deeper on some of those issues. There's certainly lots to talk about. Thank you for joining me and for opening up, sharing anecdotes from your life, some very personal stuff that it helps bring these ideas to life. And I know I appreciate it. And I'm sure everyone listening appreciates that as well. So thank you very much for joining me. It was a pleasure to talk with you.
Thanks, Dylan.